I am going to chair the Strategic Planning Committee in the absence of our chair, Mr. Martin, and our vice chair, Mr. Rude. Neither of them, both could be here yesterday, but had conflicts that took them out, or that they could not be here today. Told them they picked one of the toughest meetings that we have for Strategic Planning Committee to be absent, but we think that in light of the fact that they did so much good committee work leading up to this time, that we're hoping that we can have some very good discussion today that will give them an opportunity to continue after this with their committee meetings and resolve some of the outstanding issues. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and go to item number 2 on the agenda, which is the State University Strategic Planning. At our March meeting, Governor Martin led a discussion about topics to be included in an update to the 2005-2013 State University System Strategic Plan. We also talked about the need to simultaneously address the issue of system structure and how we're going to organize our efforts and expand the system's capacity to address student access and economic development needs in the state. Subsequent to that meeting, Committee Chair Martin and Vice Chair Rude have continued to work with the Chancellor and the staff to further clarify strategic planning priorities and to identify potential information to include in a written plan. The Strategic Planning Committee met by conference call on June 6th, which again I want to thank staff and Frank and John in their absence and the members of the committee for your commitment to this work and the time you put into that call. And during that meeting they reviewed a proposed process of moving forward with the strategic plan. So at this time I would like to ask Dr. Manier to provide us with a quick overview of that portion of the committee's discussion. Dr. Manier.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning. At the March meeting, we did take a look at a range of data that really emphasized the challenge that we face in Florida if we want Florida to significantly increase the educational attainment levels of our citizens. Additionally, you will remember that Commissioner Smith emphasized that a larger number of students are going to be coming through the K-12 sector, graduating from high school better prepared and seeking to further their education in the state university system. Chair Martin and other committee members and other board members who did participate in the call on the 6th did indicate that they wanted to go ahead and produce a written strategic plan, or a series of strategic planning documents actually. Staff have continued to gather what we consider to be critical contextual information that will help assist with this process. On the conference call, the committee reviewed an initial outline for what we're referring to as phase 1 of the strategic plan. If you turn in your agenda packets to the strategic planning committee tab and you look at the bottom right hand page numbers, on page 3 we've included a copy of the outline that was reviewed by the committee on that conference call. With this divvying up the strategic planning process into phases, the idea was that we would use this outline to complete a document that would really provide the very highest level of visioning and overarching goals for the system that we would tackle in the coming 15 to 20 years. Not unexpectedly, as we have dug into various information, the categories and topics continue to align very well with the strategic goals that this board identified in their original strategic plan, with a focus on degree attainment, both at the undergraduate and the graduate levels, that responds to changing student demands, increased competition, and very importantly, to Florida's demographic changes. It focuses on degree, research, and technology transfer goals that address the critical state needs and related areas of programmatic strategic emphasis, and as various members of the board have requested, a continuing emphasis on quality and relevance, as well as identifying select institutions and programs to move to greater levels of preeminence at the state, national, and/or international levels. One other area that multiple board members have requested that we include in the overarching goals has to do with a focus area that came up and several presentations yesterday having to do with community engagement. In the conference call, after a number of you provided staff with some additional guidance about components that you wanted to make sure that we included in our work in the coming months, you, as a committee, indicated that you thought that this organizing framework would capture the primary goal ideas or areas. If there is agreement today, what staff will do is we'll continue to work to pull together contextual information just like we did with the modeling for the baccalaureate degree attainment goals. We'll do that in each of the other areas in the coming months and work with the committee, particularly the committee chair and co-chair, to bring back to you very specific high-level goals. Now, one of the things I would point out in this conceptual framework of breaking this into phases, this visioning and overarching goal document would really just focus on the highest level goals. It would not necessarily get into the strategies as the first written document. Give you an example. If increasing the number of baccalaureate degrees awarded in the system on an annual basis to a certain level, say by 2025, is one of our overarching goals, actually one of the strategies might be to really zero in on improving retention and graduation rates at each of the institutions. Which takes us to page 5 of that document, to the section that's called From Vision and Goals to Strategy Development, Implementation, and Evaluation. And this is where the real strategic work begins. As efforts are made to really organize the system and draw on the incredible resources therein to actually realize the vision and goals that are in that phase 1 document. On the conference call, and again he reiterated it yesterday, Chancellor Brogan introduced the idea of convening what we are calling New Florida strategy teams to recommend specific initiatives, specific strategies to accomplish these high-level goals that are identified, as well as to really tackle some of the critical need areas of the state and to come together with some ideas of how the system can really position itself to be a major player in leveraging the expertise to address some of these issues. A potential list of some of the topical areas that are under consideration for the New Florida strategy teams can be found on page 6 of that section of your agenda packet. Committee members discussed one other recommendation during the conference call that I wanted to bring back to your attention. It's in the proposed outline for the strategic plan. Obviously, in an effort to fulfill your constitutional responsibility, I know that you have been advancing efforts to organize and coordinate academic programming in the system to ensure its well-planned operation and to avoid any wasteful duplication as stated in the Constitution. The question was raised as to whether at the beginning of phase 2 of the strategic planning process, the board should develop a list of academic degree programs that the board would approve for exploration in the system. For instance, what Governor Martin has proposed is he really likes the idea of a longer-term strategic plan with almost interim 5-year deep dive cycles, and whether or not the board would take into consideration from a strategic planning perspective an array of programs that the system might pursue for development in the coming 5 years. Now, such a list would certainly be informed by and would inform institutional strategic plans. One of the other items that's on the work plan for this committee, if you will remember, is that in the coming months it will be important to identify the criteria and the process that you as a board want to use to review and approve institutional strategic plans. So the academic programming component of it will be one part of that strategic planning process. A little different than implementation authorization, which this board for the baccalaureate and master's level has devolved to university boards of trustees. This is more of a strategic planning discussion. If the board chooses to develop such a multi-year strategic planning master kind of list of academic programs for exploration, certainly the board can make any necessary adjustments during the annual process that you just went through yesterday as you review updates to university work plans. So if there's a need to accommodate a unique opportunity or identified needs that pop up within the cycle, you would have a venue for doing so. Members of the committee on the call had the opportunity to talk about these ideas. Today we stand ready to try and answer any additional questions and to ask the committee to decide whether or not to encourage the full board to endorse this approach to moving forward with strategic planning in the coming months. Madam Chair?
Thank you very much, Dottie, and thank you for the work that you all have put into this process. The idea is that I would entertain a motion to actually adopt the outline that they've developed. One thought is I can go ahead and entertain the motion, then we can have discussion about any proposed changes or additional thoughts. So why don't I do that? Are you guys in a position to forward a motion that will adopt the outline that the committee has previously developed for the strategic plan? Yes, no?
I would move that we begin the strategic planning process with the idea of, in the next few months, coming up with a formal strategic plan, using this as an outline.
So is there a second? And please understand, I'm just going to put the motion on the floor, and we can have some additional discussion about any changes that you may would like to make. But I at least wanted to start the conversation with the motion. So I'm going to... Thank you, Governor Perez. So are there any thoughts about the items that they've included in the different phases? Governor Duncan, sure.
I have a question. Just so I'm clear, the 5-year look thing, so how are we really seeing that come down? I mean, are we then saying if it's not on the 5-year plan, we're not considering it, or there's some, I mean, is it just kind of out there for reference purposes? I mean, how do you see that coming down?
It's been referenced actually by board members and leadership in a number of different ways. It's almost, the chancellor likes to talk about it almost like a PICO planning process, but a list from the academic side of the house. And the idea is that this will be a strategic planning master list for exploration by institutions in the coming 5 years. And that, yes, if it's not on the list, there would be an assumption that universities would not go ahead and approve additional programs. But if there's something that pops up as far as an opportunity within the 5-year cycle, doesn't mean that the list can never be revisited, and that we have the annual process to be able to accommodate any discussions about things that need to happen in a more timely fashion.
So are we updating, so every year we would go add another year onto the list? I mean, is that the thinking, or is it?
The idea that's been proposed, and this is certainly still open for discussion, and we have it built into the outline, the delineation of the actual process at this point, is that it could actually be either. One option is to actually do a 5-year list, let it be a standing list with only making additions or corrections to the list, and then revisiting and starting with a new list at the end of 5 years. But if it serves the board better to have a rolling list, that certainly would be an option.
I guess I just a point on that, and from my opinion, our world is changing so rapidly. I'm having a hard time envisioning that we really know where we want to be 5 years from now. I mean, I think, so it being a lock-in kind of thing, I think is concerning to me. But I think having a vision of where we're trying to go and what we're doing, I don't disagree with. I'm really concerned, just even opportunities and new sciences and things that are developing, kind of just, that seems to be problematic to me.
Governor Frost?
Yes, I concur with Governor Duncan. I think it's too static to be able to just say a 5-year plan and then we'll let it roll or whatever. We have some new presidents now bringing in new ideas. They're just getting to know what's happening. We have new professors that we're hopefully bringing in who might come in with grant money, etc. Maybe they have good ideas. I don't think it can, I think it needs to be probably not 5 years out. Maybe we're just talking about a year or two at a time, or just let it roll. I like the idea of an outline of where we're going, but each university, as we've heard the last couple of days, and on our conference calls, has a unique position now, and I think they're going back again after listening to each other to start making other plans, no duplication and so forth. So I'm uptight with the idea of having a 5-year plan, and then even if we let it roll over year after year.
Yeah. one of the considerations is, you know, the development of the plan. And if this is a direction that the committee and the board was interested in, we would go ahead and develop the process. And when we work with our institutional representatives, they actually go through, most of them, a very similar process at the institutional level. The time it takes from a program to be a glimmer in a faculty member's eye all the way through to full Board of Trustees and sometimes Board of Governors approval is usually a lengthier process, except for the outstanding situation, which we want to make sure that we're able to accommodate. And the question, and they approach that from various points. Part of it is kind of a pre-plan, a white paper or whatever, a conceptual paper that talks about the program that's much less detailed than the final ready for implementation proposal, but it gives you a general sense of what would be involved in actually scaling up and taking a look at beginning to offer, you know, to explore the offering of a new program. So we would build out that process, certainly working with our institutional partners to think about how that would best work. But it's kind of a preliminary stage that's different than once you have all of the resources in place and a board is ready to make a determination of ready for implementation. So it's more from a strategic planning perspective.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, Chairman Colson?
Well, my view on this is we ought to be thinking about where we want higher education to be 20 years from now, because it's a 20-year. What's going to happen in this population of the state in the next 20 years is significant. I mean, and so when you look at where we are now with one university in the top 20 of the publics, one in the top 50, another in the top 50, and then a couple around 99 and 100, that's not good enough. California has 6 in the top 11. So we need to get our universities, you know, we should have, I think this should be a shorter document that says we want, you know, a university in the top 10, a university in the top 20, 4 in the top 50, you know, and so then those are the 6 with our medical schools, and then we ought to say our more regional universities that are focused on more undergraduate education ought to be the very best of their kind. How they do that within that is going to be very fluid and change very quickly, I would think, and differ by university. Each university is going to have a different idea about how to do that, and they should develop their own strategic plans kind of going toward these overall goals. But the overall goals should be to be the very best system that we can develop over the next 20 years. I mean, I think that's going to require some, you know, we heard it yesterday from several of the presidents. They're going to have to become very entrepreneurial, and we're going to have to control that a little bit, and they're going to go crazy when we try to control it. But I think that's our role, and there's supposed to be a tension there. And I would simplify our strategic plan, if anything, and give them some big goals, and then let's look at their strategic plans and how it lines up with our big goals. So as we go through this process, I'd like to make it, you know, if FIU wants to start a school, I want them to explain to me how it's going to move them into the top 50 over the next 20 years. And if they can't explain it to me, then they need a really good reason to do it. And maybe because I can make a lot of money on this, and I can take that money and invest it in science. And that's a good enough explanation, but it's got to be one or the other. So that's just my thought.
Governor Tripp?
One of the comments that I'm going to just tack on to what he said, but I think it's immediate. We need a 20-year goal, but to be frank with you, we need to get something started now. I had a conversation with President Machen a couple of minutes ago. I mean, we've got to start now. Having another long-range plan, we want to get what he just talked about now. So part of this has to be what step do we take immediately to start this process? And we've got to force it. We need to make sure that all of the universities are in agreement with it, and that they're not fighting each other about which one is going to be here and which one is going to be there, that we're supportive of all of them, and that we help them achieve that goal, but we come to some conclusion pretty quick.
I guess the question I would have, Dottie, is based upon the way that this is currently phased out with all the parts that you have, how long will it take to have a completed document based upon the current outline?
A very good question, Madam Chair. I apologize for not explaining that further to begin with. Although we're talking in phases, we're definitely talking about overlapping phases. The Chancellor is talking about convening these teams immediately. As I sat and listened to Provost Wilcox report out on the work that the Provost has done, I think a lot of those ideas can be incorporated, acted on immediately. Madam Chair, I know that you want to have some discussions later in this agenda about some things that involve taking action immediately. So I definitely see them as overlapping. As far as timeframes are concerned, what Governor Martin has spoken to staff about is actually having this kind of high-level document with the contextual information you need to be able, for instance, if you, again, to pick up on Provost Wilcox's comments in the earlier meeting about, you know, what is the system, to what peers does the system aspire, or to dig under the actual rankings, what metrics does the system want to look at to see how we're moving forward towards what Governor Colson has mentioned. Those kinds of things can start right away, even as we're finishing out a written document. Governor Martin has asked that we try to get the overarching high-level document, and I think this will be responsive to what Governor Colson said. Talk about a very short document in the grand scheme of things for that first document by the end of the calendar year. But it wouldn't take. But these other things wouldn't wait until that was done, is what my point is that they would be overlapping.
So we're thinking that, okay, so answer my next question then. So if you're going to be done with that by the end of the year, then when do you anticipate you'll be completely done?
Well, I see personally, and I think this aligns with what Governor Rood and Governor Martin have been talking about, is that it's a dynamic process, as opposed to here is a strategic plan. It's a strategic planning process. And once you have those few overarching goals that you're talking about, Dean Colson, that you're moving, and that some things will get done very quickly, some things will be much more long-term. I know that Governor Beard in our earlier conversations was talking about if you're thinking about building buildings and thinking about the whole facilities component of it, you have to be thinking out further. That's going to be a different kind of conversation than actions that the universities mentioned in their work plans that they want to take this year to start moving the needle on some of the metrics that would be embedded in the strategic plan. So again,
but kind of what I hear you saying is that we'll never finish that. It's just we'll get this one document by the end of the year, and we'll continue the conversation.
As far as the strategies, as far as the implementation components of it, I think that that's a much more dynamic process. But as far as the overarching goals, absolutely by the end of the year.
How do the 5-year plans fit into that?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a little bit, yeah, ask that
Sorry,
question.
so then how do the 5-year, plans fit into if we're not ending and we're not rolling? How does that work?
Again, the concept is if you have an overarching goal that you're trying to raise the system to a certain level on a series of metrics, that's your visioning document. At the beginning, another component of it, what was recommended is that as part of the strategic planning process, we would get into a 5-year cycle or rolling cycle or whatever you all choose from looking at the academic programming side of that. That's one zone of activity relative to strategic planning is planning about academic programming. There will be some other activities going on as well as we talk about, how the board sees really expanding capacity. That's likely to be on a somewhat different timeline than an academic programming timeline. So it's not something that matches up. All the timelines will be totally synced.
Governor Frost, you have a comment?
Yeah, I do. I think a lot of work went into this. I really do. And we spent hours on the phone discussing a lot of this. On the other hand, I think we all know that we want to move quickly. And so I personally think maybe we should not take any vote on this particular outline, and I know it's just an outline, and we discuss it some more and come back maybe towards the end of the year with another kind of an outline. Because I think every one of our 11 universities already know what the goals are of the system. And they already have heard all of us say we want to have universities in that top tier quickly. And we've been talking about ways of getting there. So maybe we should, even though we spent lots of hours, both staff and all of us with this, maybe this is not something, Madam Chair, that we should consider, and we just pull it from the agenda right now, and we go back. I don't know how you make that motion, but we go back to the drawing board and come up with a one-page outline of what we've heard over the last few days as to where we're really going.
Governor Duncan?
I guess I'm not sure I'm quite there yet with throwing the whole thing out versus, I think it's important that we give our staff some direction and an outline and kind of we start going forward versus just continuing to discuss. But I guess I still am kind of coming down with concern that the 5-year planning part of this is just going to become more of a challenge to manage and to keep accurate. As I sit here and think, I'm like, okay, so then we approve it. Does that mean we're kind of pre-approving all those programs once they get on the plan? Then what are you giving us to look at it? I mean, where does that spiral? Where does that stop? We already have an approval process by program. I'm trying to think, how do we actually manage that to make that a good vision? I really like where Governor Colson is going with the bigger goals and challenging requests up against those goals and how they fit into that. And maybe, I don't know, Governor Colson, with the outline we have, I mean, do you see what you're looking for in that kind of upfront part of it? Does it fit one of these phases okay?
I said this on the telephone call. I think it needs to be shorter and smaller, and my motion, I'd like us just to encourage staff to go forward and refine this based upon the comments of the committee today, and bring it back to us. That's all I was really trying to say. I think this is something we should have, but it's kind of hard to grab hold of, and and so we need to review strategic plans from our universities, and we need to. And I'd like to say, okay, this is what they're trying to do. This is how they're going to get there. They know better than I do how to get there, but this is what they're saying, and it lines up. And I think that's our goal, to see how it lines up. Now, what we haven't talked about here is some of this may be, there's a reason to spend money on things for job creation. The universities have that, and that may not necessarily line up with the goal of moving a university into the top 50. But at least we can have a discussion about it in that context and say, we're doing this because it's job creation. It's not going to move us in a direction, but let's discuss it in that context.
But then why couldn't it, if that's important, and if that's something that's going to be an important part of, I guess, the development and possibly the economic development of the state, why couldn't job creation and or some variation of that also be one of the goals that's outlined? I don't know if that will fit into what your vision is.
Maybe it can. I haven't tried to write it, but it's just, I don't think we want a 20-page document. I think we want a 2 or 3 page document that we can hand to our president and say, this is the goals of what we're looking for, and these are, go to work on it.
Governor Perez, then Governor Duncan.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I feel like we're over-lawyering this thing to death. I've got to go with Governor Colson on this. My vision would be a macro document that sets out aspirational goals, and it's divided in 2 pieces. One piece is what the board can do and work on and help facilitate, examining alternative financing plans for PICO, examining, some of the macro issues that we can look at as a board, and then put those aspirational goals out there and then see what the universities give us back in their strategic plans to reach those aspirational goals. They're the ones who know how to get there. And then sit down together and craft a statewide plan. But I think it's our job to give the aspirational goals, and I mean, I think staff has heard where we're going. I mean, I think we've got a decent amount of direction on this at this point. I mean, I'm thinking macro aspirational goals, as Dean says, but a separate section where we explore challenges and charge ourselves with challenges regarding long-term funding plans, dedicated funding sources for PICO, finding other alternative programs where we can use a system. But the inputs, I think, on the balance of the plan, once we give the goals, have got to come from the individual universities.
Governor Duncan?
One thing that I heard from Dr. Wilcox and the provost this morning, and we heard it last night in the discussion, was I think it's a very valid request that they brought forward to us, which is we have some system aspirational peers. And when I hear you talk about that, I think that's an important component of the macro vision as we're looking at it, that we're laying out, are we trying to be North Carolina or Michigan or California or whatever it may be, and I'm not suggesting any of them as we're starting on the discussion, but that really should be, again, in setting kind of the system goals, when we talk about wanting 4 or 5 or where does that compare, and that gives us at least maybe a structure to compare to what we have within the system, what we're missing, what we're looking at, versus it trying to, build from the not micromanaging, but the looking at just the strategic plan and the 5-year out part of it. So I guess I like the idea of both Governor Perez and Colson and kind of the whole direction of where we're going with a shorter plan. But I do think that that's some time that we should block out before it gets adopted, and that is, where do we want to measure the system versus always just holding them accountable for where are they measuring up against their peers.
Yeah, the one thing I want to get a sense of from you all is she mentioned that they have this idea of having these work groups that talk about the New Florida Initiative the New Florida Initiative and where all that fits in. And I want to see how you all feel about that component. So, Donnie, give me like a 1 minute. What was the vision for that, so they can hear that and see if they want to include that as a part of the process or not.
Madam Chair, if I might, since the Chancellor is here, Chancellor, asking for a 1-minute overview of your concept of the New Florida strategy teams.
You got a better shot at doing it in 1 minute than I do.
Second that.
That's true.
We don't want to look at these Tennessee colors all day
Okay,
either.
boss, track me on this, make sure I represent your idea well. There are these high-level overarching goals that have been mentioned that I don't think are actually going to extend beyond what you're talking about. I think we are talking a very short document to get it. But then it's like, okay, how do we organize to accomplish it? And I think that the Chancellor's concept on this is, what would it look like from a systemic perspective, or pulling on the work that's being done at the individual institutions to be able to tackle some of the goals that are there? What would it take to move the metrics? As well as, if we say that one of our goals is to really take advantage of the expertise of the system to address some critical state needs, what might it look like to pull together a team to actually develop a plan, a kind of a mini plan, an implementation plan for how we would go about doing that?
So does that does that mean that you'll have these different work groups and you're going to go around to these, we're going to plan 10 meetings, and in these 10 meetings this group is going to come up with these ideas that we can fold into the plan? I guess I'm asking the question because I don't know whether or not from what I'm hearing from this group, that's not the type of planning that they may feel is necessary in order to go into this. So before you invest the amount of time, I want to have a better feel for what it is so they can weigh in on what they think is a good use of our time or not. So don't let me put words into your mouth. Is it that you're going to have 10 meetings and you have a representative from each university at the meeting and you come up with this? What is it that, and Frank, I may need to look to you, what is it that you were looking for when you kind of had this vision for?
Yes, ma'am. Clearly, we can't do this without input from the institutions. The whole idea behind this is to not only create a strategic plan for the Board of Governors, but one that aligns with the 11 universities. Otherwise, we're going to have two different directions here. So the idea is to create an overlay as to where we would like our system to go at the system level, and then each university's part in not only creating something special at their institution, but contributing to the system getting there. So I agree that what we need to do as this thing unfolds, and believe me, this is at the first basic and rudimentary step of this thing. This process it's going to take a while. You don't create a strategic plan for a system this large and this diverse in a state this big and this diverse without spending time and getting people to invest their time in the dialogue that you're going to need to align this thing. Yesterday was a good example. We heard 11 unique work plans as to where each university is and wants to go. How do we make sure that where that is taking the institution also works in alignment with where the system wants to go and believes it needs to go at the same time? So there's going to have to be a great deal of dialogue. There's going to have to be a great deal of exchange. In the middle of all of that, by the way, not to further complicate, but it does, we're also engaged in looking at our organizational structure for the state university system, and through the Higher Ed Coordinating Council, we're also looking at the way we're organized completely in higher education, including the Florida State College system. So that's why you can't stop, create a strategic plan, hand it off, and hope it matches with where this whole thing is going for the future. It's got to align, and I would submit it's going to take time, and it's going to take a great deal of input from a lot of people to get it there. What was put in front of you today is just what it looks like. It is a rough draft, a template, if you will, of the kinds of things that people who have contributed to this feel are important to a strategic plan. The format for the strategic plan, and then more importantly, what goes into it, will be evolutionary and will take us time and lots of energy.
I think, yeah, Governor Tripp?
What bothers me is that we need to have a few specific things that we can identify with and that we can target, and then we've got to challenge the universities to accomplish it. You know, the challenge has got to be, get there. Tell us how you're going to get University of Florida. Just looking at the list of where you lie, there are universities out there that are ripe for the taking. You can overtake them, okay? A lot of them are in California with big financial problems and everything else. But the problem we've got is that what always, and I hate to say this, but in education, there's always so much out there, you can hide behind everything. Okay, and I always wonder what happens to the reports. I think there's a vault somewhere in Tallahassee where we put all of these. But in my experience, we need to have some definite goals that we all agree on. We've got to set some of them. The universities may say, I don't want to go there. But as a system, we may say, no, that's where we want to go, and we challenge you to get there. That's the kind of document that I hope we could get to, and it's very clear. Everybody understands that this is what we're trying to do. Then we'll know if we do it or not.
Governor Beard?
I just, I wanted to be a little more practical maybe about this. I think the 5-year plans for growth that the universities presented were about 38,000 people, new students, new FTEs in the next 5 years. I mean, if you multiply that times 4, that's over 100,000 new students in our system in 20 years. Now, I don't know how we get that with the financing that we've got available to us right now. I don't know how we get there with the facilities we're talking about. We're talking about 2 or 3 new universities. I mean, I think this board needs to figure out how we get there and how we and the universities get there together and how we finance them and where they ought to be and all those kind of strategic issues. And also work on the quality problem, which we've talked about. And to get there, I think that we've got to have a 20-year plan that we, like Dean said, that we have overarching goals, and then we work on the details through the university system, through each university as to how they're going to do it. And I just think it's a huge problem. If we don't tackle it now, we'll never have the facilities or the stuff we need.
I guess that, Governor Duncan?
I have one other question, maybe when staff comes back they can incorporate, because I'm still trying to reconcile what all we heard yesterday and all these plans. And, we were looking at LBR requests and visions and goals, and, by acquiescence of not responding, does that mean we were kind of good with everything they got? And kind of where and how does that all fit into it? I don't think that was the case. At least I didn't intend that, because I don't think we had enough time for dialogue on all those things. But there were a lot of big things in those plans that we haven't yet really had time to talk about. I just logistically, how those dialogues happen and when and how we get there, I would like to understand a little better maybe as they come back with a new outline.
I guess just a short answer to your kind of immediate question as to whether, or since we did not have much dialogue on, let's say, proposed LBR requests or definite things that require, some level of approval, then just the fact that we didn't have a conversation about it does not mean that we acquiesced. To me, it was more the university putting us on notice as to what they anticipate to present at the appropriate time and how they fit that into their vision for their work plan for the next year. So please don't feel that because there was no conversation on those items that there's some assumption that we've already said yay or nay. It just means that now we have a better vision of what each university is considering, and we know how to fold it into kind of how we look at the entire request at the time that those, requests would be submitted. So feel comfortable with that. My concern is that I feel that what I'm hearing from the around the table today is different from what's in this document, and it's kind of different from what I think the Chancellor may have been thinking about. And I want to make sure that we at least leave here with some idea of what our next steps are. Governor Perez.
You might have canceled my next thought. My next thought was we are not going to renegotiate this here.
Right.
And what I'm thinking is perhaps what we need is a separate committee meeting, but not by phone, in person, where we can all sit down and talk about this issue as a separate committee meeting prior to our next board meeting. And if there was a second, I was going to move to table this until that committee meeting, so then we can talk about it and redo it, because we're not going to rewrite it on the fly, Madam Chair.
I'll withdraw my motion. Or a second your motion to table my motion.
Whatever's, Madam Secretary, whatever's easier. Is it easier for the maker of the motion to withdraw, or is it easier to accept that?
Easier for the maker of the motion to withdraw
I'm fine.
and then move to table.
I'll move to table this to a specially called meeting of the Strategic Planning Committee where we can actually focus on this, but I would really like it to be an in-person meeting.
Okay. I'm sorry. And do I need to vote on that? I need a second on the motion to table the issue. Okay. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Okay. You had a comment, Chancellor Burrow?
Yes, ma'am. I just want you to understand, this came as a result of the work of two of our board members. This is not my work. I'm not distancing myself from it at all, but I just don't want anybody here to think that this was created by staff in a back room and then rolled out to you today. This came as a result of more than one meeting of the leadership of the Strategic Planning Committee. This is what they felt was going to be important to try to create some sort of template. Now, obviously, those two wonderful guys couldn't be here today, but I did want you to know that they're trying to get us, and they would be the first ones to tell you, and we talked about it when we were at that meeting. There's no perfect way to do this, but they were trying to come up with a basic template of the important issues that we're going to have to tackle in the strategic planning process. But I can probably, at the risk of speaking for them, tell you they won't have a problem going back. They very much wanted to hear the feelings of the board, but provide something to start with rather than a blank sheet of paper. And I think I can speak for the chair of the Strategic Planning Committee, Frank Martin, when I say that we've talked about it. He was very anxious in hearing what the board was interested in doing with strategic planning. They both know this is going to be a long process requiring lots of input to come up with something everybody is ready to live with at the end of the day. But I just wanted to make you aware of that.
guess the only thing I want to add to what you're saying, and again, we appreciate the time that Frank and John put into this, and I know you've worked very closely with them, Dottie, and yourself, Chancellor Brogan, is that I think what the board is thinking is that it's not a long process. And I think that may be where the committee needs to come together and get on the same page. Because if I can see, if anything, that's the biggest difference between kind of your recap of the previous conversations and the conversation that we had prior to your coming in after meeting with the new trustees, is that this board is anticipating that it shouldn't be a long process. So that means that the committee does need to come together and kind of get on the same page about what it is that we think makes sense as far as developing a strategic plan, because I think the consensus is that it shouldn't be some long, drawn-out process, that we can sit down, develop system-wide goals, and put it together, particularly since this isn't the first time we've done it. We're kind of building on something that was already out there. So, but that's the sentiment that kind of went on. I wanted to make sure you were aware of it, since you...
Maybe long is the wrong word. Maybe laborious is the right word. It will take as long as it has to take, and hopefully it will happen sooner than later. But the point is, it's going to be labor intensive, because you can't create it in a back room. It's going to require lots of input from a lot of people if it's going to be done well. And that was their take as well, that we were going to have to work closely with the universities to make sure that this aligns. So maybe laborious is more appropriate than long.
Gotcha. They're telling me I'm taking too long. I'm sorry,
No,
Dr.
no,
Bannon.
that's all right. I just wanted to, as a member of the sort of the small six, we talk about lists of being the top 50, and that's wonderful. I think it's a great goal. But in this planning, I think we ought to make sure that we aren't all trying to be in the top 50 of research institutions, that all of us have goals and we meet different needs of higher education in the state. And we need to support each other in that way, as institutions, as that way. And that's where our strategic plans need to work in harmony with each other. We don't all need fancy PhD programs. We don't all need to be public masters. We need to find a way to not all try to be the same thing. And I know that's duplication, and we're all aware of it. But I mean in our strategic development, that we have an opportunity here, especially with the state college system as it is developing, to be something that the higher education in this state and in this country has never been. And in this planning process, all of us have different roles. And to honor that and to make sure that we all are playing on the same team is extremely important. I want to play with everybody. I want our graduates to meet workforce needs, to go into the PhD programs at all different levels. I just wanted to say that because we all shouldn't want to be in the top 50. We have some that are on the cusp to be AAU, and we, as the smaller institutions, have ways that we can help support them reach those goals too, and still meet a different need of higher education in the state.
What's that? Gus?
You can't attend the meetings of the Board of Governors for 4 years without understanding the sincerity and determination of these presidents and their universities. And what's California? They got 4 in the top 10. We have 1 in whatever number is. We have great universities, and we should be the guiding force, the Board of Governors, to lead our presidents into being in the top 10 or 20 or whatever it is. I think that's our responsibility. And I agree with the president, and collaboratively working together is the way to do it.
So I think you've gotten some direction, Dottie. I think that the one thing that I'm hearing clearly is that can you immediately go back and start working on a date for a meeting of the Strategic Planning Committee. Governor Perez has suggested that it be in person. I'd like to ask if you would have Governor Rood and Governor Martin agree to a time prior to the September board meeting so that some of these issues can be ironed out.
Yes, ma'am.
We're going to go on to item number B, organizing the system for success.
We never voted on that.
I did vote, didn't I? I thought I did vote. I did not?
Vote again. Vote on the motion.
I'm sure I did, didn't I? This side table didn't hear it, but this side of the table heard it, right? And they carried on this side. Okay, so just so it's clear on this side, since you're writing it down.
I don't
Yeah. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay. Yeah, I heard it on this side. Yeah, okay. Yeah. No.
Everybody's
Item B, organizing a system for success. As a part of our ongoing effort to better organize and manage the system, we've been reviewing and updating a series of board regulations. During the June 6th conference call, this committee considered 3 proposed regulations designed to facilitate expansion of the system's capacity and to ensure better communication and coordination within the system. Given the complex nature of the issues under consideration and the 3 proposed regulations, members have asked that we discuss them further today and then consider them for public notice. I know there have been some differing opinions as to what should be included in these regulations. Therefore, let me first remind everyone of the regulation development procedures adopted by the board in March of 2006. Those procedures specify that any person may submit written comments concerning a proposed regulation, amendment, or repeal to the contact person identified in the notice within 14 days after the date of notice on the internet website. In response, the board may solicit additional written comments, schedule a public hearing, withdraw or modify the regulation, amendment, or repeal in whole or in part after notice, or proceed with adopting the regulation. Because the regulations are so interconnected, I'm asking staff to present all 3 of them together, and then we will take questions after the presentation. I do want to give you guys some idea of the direction that we're going in before we start the conversation, so we're pretty much on the same page. I'm hoping that we can at least get to a point where we can notice the item now, with the understanding that the Strategic Planning Committee, with the leadership of Frank and John, will continue to work with the universities on coming up with some regulation that makes sense, and that between now and September we'll have a regulation that we can all pretty much work with and agree upon. The other thing I wanted to just have everyone keep in mind, that this is not meant to be something to inhibit economic development or to inhibit growth or to inhibit collaboration. The idea is that if we communicate, we think that that'll be the best way to get things accomplished. And I think the direction that we're going in is certainly less cumbersome than some of the things we currently have on the record. So with that, I'm going to ask, are you going to come up first, Richard? Richard, if you would come up. I know you and Nancy have been working on these regulations. Present the items, and we can get some input from the board and our presidents.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll try to be very brief on this. The one thing I would also point out before we get started is that each of you should have an amended regulation for academic program coordination that was amended in response to the requests of several board members.
Is this a document?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so this is a document you guys should have had at your place.
Well, what I'd like to do is actually start with the continuing education regulation, and this was an existing board. This board regulation was an existing regulation for the a rule of the Board of Regents. It was first promulgated in 1970 and last amended in 1993. And language in the existing regulation is not aligned with the current structure of the state university system. And it's also generally considered to be much too centralized and restrictive to facilitate university efforts to be responsive to the needs of the state. A work group consisting of board and university staff was convened in 2007 and really began to work to update this regulation. Unfortunately, those efforts were put on hold after a year of work because it became apparent that the regulation could not be amended unless the educational sites regulation was also addressed at the same time. Additionally, more guidance was needed from the board regarding the coordination of academic programming across the geographic areas that existed in the continuing education regulation. The work group was reconvened in January of 2011 as things began to move with the educational sites regulation. And in drafting the proposed regulation, board staff and the work team reviewed the policies of other university systems, and we solicited inputs, of course, from members of the universities and then the university general councils and also the provosts and other key university staff. And as you can see on the screen, what we attempted to do was to really kind of redefine continuing education within the context of this particular regulation. And one, it's a self-supporting activity. It's generally not funded through the E&G appropriations that are used to fund most of the educational activities of the system. Whoops, went backwards too quick. A lot of times the continuing education has been viewed as being non-credit courses, but in fact, for many years, it's been credit courses and programs that are offered as well. And so one of the key aspects of it is that it's got to be credit courses and programs that are not in competitions with the courses receiving the state funding. And this is basically to keep the funding separate, the funding stream separate, and also to make sure that that the resources of the university don't go towards continuing education over the state-funded courses. And it also contains a lot of non-credit courses or programs that are designed primarily for professional development. And the other thing is that, you know, there needed to be a clarification on how the funding was accomplished at the university, and also the administration of the program. So the funds are typically deposited in the auxiliary budgeted entities, with the exception that in those cases where you have a sponsored credit institute, and that's an institute where someone actually pays the university generally to come in and offer programs and provides all the cost of doing so, those can be deposited in the contracts and grants entity. The proposed amendments to the regulation will add a reporting requirements. There are actually reporting requirements in the existing regulation, but they're such that no one really knows exactly where the information is coming in at anymore. And this is going to consolidate the information in a way that's going to actually provide the Board of Governors with a much better understanding of the revenues, expenditures, FTE, and especially the degrees earned through continuing education. Generally, the work group thought this was an important aspect that was not being captured in the existing regulation. Is that, you know, if you're going to talk about degrees earned or set goals for degrees earned for the system, that you really need to also be addressing those that are earned through continuing education. Another thing that has happened more recently is with the passage of the market rate tuition, that the continuing education regulation as it exists now was in really direct conflict with the regulation for market rate tuition. So the amended regulation then is basically doing away with this disconnect for the market rate. And then the other piece of it that was decided by the work group to not be really pertinent to continuing education as much as it was academic program coordination was the outdated geographic service areas. And these were areas that were actually assigned to the universities many years back, and when the regulation was in its early stages, and they had not been updated since then. The Board of Regents did establish a policy that identified service areas for Florida Gulf Coast University when it was first started, but these were never put into a regulation. So with that, I'll go on then to the Academic Program Coordination Regulation. And this is a new regulation being proposed to really kind of capture some of the activities that are ongoing within the system. And basically it's going to combine elements from both the continuing education regulation and also some of the activities that have been ongoing with regard to trying to coordinate programs across the system through the initiatives like the CAVP project and through other joint efforts. The first section of the proposed regulation would put into place a formal process for review of the state university system degree program offerings and proposed new degree program offerings. And this process would then be designed to inform both institutional and system-level strategic planning. The second section of the draft regulation has been proposed to assist universities in their efforts to coordinate programming across the state and demonstrate the state's commitment to economic development through alignment with the economic regions that were established by Enterprise Florida Incorporated. Now, although this section is derived in part from the concept of service areas within the outdated continuing education regulation, and and certain institutions would be designated as lead within their particular regions, it's not intended to limit any university from offering academic programs on a statewide basis as long as they can be coordinated to avoid unnecessary or wasteful duplication. And the other feeling was that establishing a leadership role for the universities within the economic regions they are located is consistent with the state's strategic plan for economic development. We spoke with staff at the Enterprise Florida to get a better idea of how the regions were developed. And then one of the things that they really reiterated to us was that in many cases the universities have a long history with engagement in their particular economic development region, and they are a catalyst for growth in those regions. What I show up here on your map is actually the Enterprise Florida regions as they exist now, in discussion with the Enterprise Florida staff, to try to explain to us how they arrived at these particular regions. Some of the things they pointed out was, well, the regions are incorporated into the state strategic plan for economic development, but they were developed through the process of pulling together local forums and trying to find common interest within the different regions or different areas of the state. Some of them were pretty well established in operation to begin with, like the Tampa Bay region is very well organized and has been an ongoing organized effort for some time. Over time, the regions, they have been actually remaining pretty stable. There's been one county or two counties that have decided to go along and line themselves with a different region. But primarily, the Enterprise Florida staff, told us that they seem to have congealed. They seem to be operating pretty much as regions, and that also the universities are considered major partners in those regions. Now, it's important to keep in mind that these regions are not the same as the enterprise zones that are also addressed by Enterprise Florida. Those enterprise zones are primarily focused on particular industries that may be scattered across the state, whereas the regions are really the organized efforts of the individual companies and entities within the particular region. And one thing that I thought was very telling when we were discussing these regions with the Enterprise Florida staff is they basically said, the state economy actually functions regionally, that Florida does not have one large state economy, that these regions tend to be focused around industries and business interests in their areas and the community efforts in their areas. And so that's one reason that they basically evolved out from the forum groups in the fashion that they exist. But when it comes down to actually deciding which university might take a lead responsibility for which region, it was a pretty simple process. We basically said, where are they? And in this particular case, you can see that they are actually located in the region that they have been designated as a leader in within the map. The one exception being, of course, the South Central region, where there's actually no university main campus. And in this particular case, there's actually three universities, actually four universities, if you want to count the University of Florida, and their regional education center from IFAS that are providing services in this particular region. Going back to at this point, to the proposed change in the regulation, as I said earlier, there were several members that pointed out that we really needed to address the cooperative extension efforts of the two state universities that are land-grant institutions. So there's some part of your language is very specific to those cooperative extension services. However, you will note that we did not go and make that expand that out to include degree programs. And then the other thing that was pointed out to us by a member, which was, was that we had not included New College of Florida within this particular regulation. And we had initially left it off because the New College is pretty much a standalone little organization, with its degree programs. But then somebody started pointing out, they're very involved in community service and community engagement, and that's a good portion of what this regulation is actually about. So we've added them in on as well. And at this point, Madam Chair, I'd like to turn it over to Nancy McKee to continue with the rest of the presentation.
All right. Thank you very much, Richard. Nancy?
As the board discussed in its conference call on June 6th, the last section of that regulation provides a process that the university would use when it desires to offer a college credit degree or certificate program or significant part of a program which requires a substantial physical presence in another university's region.
Nancy, can you just speak up a little bit, please?
You want to start over?
No, don't
No?
start over.
Okay.
Just speak louder.
The president would notify the chancellor and initiate a discussion with the other presidents in the region. It's proposed that if the presidents are not able to reach a mutual agreement, then the chancellor would mediate and/or request a final resolution from the board. The one issue that we did not address in the regulation was the time frame in which these discussions and a resolution from the board would occur. Our intent was that and our assumption was that those discussions and the board resolution would be handled as expeditiously as possible. So the board may want to consider either amending the regulation or articulating a time frame in its internal operating procedures. The last regulation you'll find on page 21 in your agenda packet behind the Strategic Planning Committee tab. That's Regulation 8.009, the educational sites. And as mentioned in previous committee meetings, the regulation was initially a rule of the former Board of Regents, and so as such, it does not reflect the governance structure of the state university system. Because it does not delineate the planning and approval processes that the board expects of itself and of the Board of Trustees, there's been a lot of confusion as to what should be brought before the board for approval. Now this slide shows you a snapshot of the number of sites that the universities have identified as being in the current classifications. It also shows the primary gaps that we identified in the educational sites regulation, and we addressed each one of those gaps in the proposed regulation that you have in your agenda packet. Specific approval processes are being proposed to make clear the requests that are expected to go to the boards of trustees for approval, as well as those that then need to come to the Board of Governors for approval. The current regulation also requires that the universities obtain approval from the Board of Regents before any lower level courses are offered off the main campus. The proposed regulation would provide the universities with flexibility to offer a limited number of lower level courses that address specific program needs. If the universities want to offer lower level courses that would generate greater than 25% of its FTE at the lower level, then the universities would need to come to the Board of Governors for approval. Three other issues that we included for your consideration were the development of standard proposal formats, the inclusion of international branch campuses and special purpose centers in the proposals, and action to be taken when enrollment at branch campuses drops below the minimum for the given classification for 3 years in a row. And so, Madam Chair, those are the highlights of the three regulations.
Thank you very much, Nancy. I think that the idea is that after receiving the overview from both Nancy and Richard, we'd have an opportunity for some discussion. As I mentioned, our goal, our plan is that with the leadership of John and Frank, we will continue to work on on these proposed regulations so we can come up with something that we think the universities and the board can agree upon. But I thought it was important that we have the conversation so that if you all have thoughts or ideas that can be used as guiding principles as we move through this, then at least they'll have the benefit of the thoughts from the board as well as from the presidents. And additionally, ideally we will go ahead and agree to notice the items today so that way we can ensure we're pushing the conversation forward. So I guess I'd like to open it up to any general discussion from the board. I feel like we've been talking about this for a long time, but I don't know if anyone has any thoughts or comments that they want to add at this time. Yeah, Governor Duncan?
The first regulation about the continuing education and the reporting requirements, I'm not making it as a recommendation, but I just want to know, was there any thought given to the outcomes also being reported? We talked about it some yesterday with these programs, and if they're going to report that, you know, if they're, I don't know if we, I know we don't have agreed upon outcomes, but at least maybe there's some consideration of that, you know, if we're going to, it looks like now all we care about is they're profitable. I think, yeah, maybe we want to care about the students are getting the education they bought with those outcomes as well.
We have, if you'll look on page 9 of your agenda packet, you'll see the specific issues that the universities will be reporting on each year, and they do include the degrees earned, the certificates earned.
So we'll have the enrollment, and then so we're basically saying if they pass, they accomplished it. That's the goal. That's okay.
So you.
That's for the credit courses. For the non-credit, they would be reporting the enrollees.
Okay.
Chancellor Brogan?
Yes, ma'am. Just a general comment on behalf of these regulations and even others. In working with Governors Rood and Governor Martin and others, trying to formulate the basic tenets of what you see before you, it was a starting point. The idea with our regulatory process is to create something that we can post and then begin the process of change, if necessary, up until the point we bring back the final version to the board for their ultimate approval. You all, since you've sat here as board members, have been through a part of this process, some of you for years, so that's the way the promulgation process works. As to these specific regulations, the idea is as much what they are meant to do as what they're not meant to do. And what they're not meant to do is to hold people within those regions. Those are strictly for purposes of economic development. And most universities are already engaged in regional economic development efforts in those regions as it exists. Those are lifted straight from the Enterprise Florida folks, and as Nancy and or Richard mentioned, I can't remember who, Enterprise Florida said we're already working with the universities in those regions. So these are meant to be different than the old service districts that largely bound people in place to a particular service area. They are meant to demonstrate the board and the institution's commitment to regional, state, and national economic development opportunities as well. At the same time, it is clear that not only currently do universities move in and out of these enterprise areas. A good example of that, I think, maybe the best example of that is the I-4 corridor. I mean, there's an incredible cohesive approach to economic development with universities, USF, UF, and UCF working collaboratively beyond and in each other's service areas to provide economic development in what has become, I think, a model for good cooperative economic development across the central part of the state of Florida. So even though some have suggested these are to hold people down, not at all. That simply wouldn't be in the best interest of the Board of Governors or the state of Florida, but it is meant to organize our process to make sure that at the same time we're helping individual universities do what they need to do, go where they need to go, but at the same time do it in an organized approach that is efficient and gets us all where we need to go. I also want to add on a comment to something Nancy mentioned, what this isn't. It's not meant to create a bureaucratic entanglement that will last forever in making important decisions. That timeline issue revolving around the point where if two or more universities can't reach an agreement on movement or program offerings, it is easy to lay a timeline up against that to make sure that we're not stifling economic development opportunities. I know, having been there, that economic development has timelines of its own that sometimes don't jive with state or federal requirements, and if you miss the train, you miss the opportunity. These things don't have to take a long time to gel and to ultimately reach resolution if resolution is necessary to call for. The one thing I know about this board, among many, is the fact that they are very open to pulling together on a moment's notice if it's necessary to make a decision on an issue. We do it all the time. Through conference calls, as Governor Perez mentioned, members are willing to get together if necessary, and I think timelines on this process would be very appropriate to not only demonstrate that we want these to be done in rapid turnaround, to be able to create economic development opportunities, but also so everybody knows what the rules of engagement are and by when people are expected to make decisions. I also know, because I've worked with this system in this capacity now for over a year and a half, that it's remarkable how often when people do communicate, they work out their own issues, and it never does reach the level of having to make decisions for them. I could cite a long list of examples, I won't today, where I have been engaged in those conversations, or at least been made aware those conversations are taking place and don't necessitate anybody else getting involved. People have a great capacity to work these issues out among themselves in our state university system. But it is getting more complex. It is not only our state university system. We're now working in a different capacity with the Florida college system, with the private providers. This is simply, I think, our attempt to make sure that we're well organized as we move forward, while still allowing creativity, innovation, entrepreneurial spirit to be one of the hallmarks of our state university system. But we will be glad to entertain more ideas, more opportunities as it relates to these three regs and all of our regs as this thing moves forward.
Governor Beard and then Governor Stopper.
I'm not sure that what we're seeing before us today does what I think they ought to do, but I'd like to walk through three important points that I think they ought to do, and see if what we've got is what I think we're looking for. First of all, it would seem to me that we don't want universities building educational classroom facilities in other people's backyards, so to speak, and because the state can't afford to do that. I mean, we've already got facilities there. So when it comes to education, I think that's kind of the area, and I don't think the presidents want to go in other people's backyards with facilities and classrooms and new facilities. Secondly, I don't think we want to create any impediments to the private sector or research efforts of any of the universities, similar to what happened at FSU a couple of meetings ago. We want the private sector to access all our universities and have free access to them. And we want our universities to be able to provide research, wherever it's appropriate for them to provide it. Thirdly, I think distance learning ought to be market-driven. I know there's some issues as it relates to distance learning that requires physical facilities, 20% or some kind of inside classroom activities, but and we need to work that out. But the distance learning effort should be free for everybody, and everybody ought to be able to go where they need to be because it's, as we know, over the internet. And so that's kind of the three principles that I had in my mind. I don't know if that's what this says or not, but that's where I'd like to see it go.
Thanks, Governor Beard. Governor Stavros.
Well, Madam Chair, I just want to make a comment based on the comment I've heard. And for the benefit of any new member of the Board of Governors, including our new student governor, every member of the Board of Governors is on the Strategic Planning Committee, and input is welcome. Is that correct, Madam Chair?
Actually, not exactly. It used to be that the whole board served as a part of the committee, but now we have specific members. But because we tend to meet like this is an appropriate time for everyone to add comment.
Okay.
But we do have specific members of the
Thank you.
Strategic Planning Committee. Any other comments? Sure.
So help me understand just how we see this coming down. I get mailings from University of Florida for certificates in project management this and Lean Sigma this. I get them from USF. I happen to live in Tampa, so that's not so weird, but I'm guessing I'd get them if I lived in Orlando or West Palm or something like that. How do those programs, when you guys are coming in, maybe some of it's online, but I mean, they usually are like held at a hotel for 3 or 4 days and they're doing, teaching that. It results in a certificate. Where does that fit into? Are they going to now have to go back and get permission to do it because they're not in Tampa and they're mailing it to me and I'm in Tampa and they're coming to the Marriott Waterside? I mean, help me understand. Does the physical presence rule kind of fix that because it's not a permanent physical presence, or?
The physical presence is if more than 20% of a course is provided face-to-face, then it would fall under this substantial physical presence. But
So
if it's
they would then. So basically, if you're going face-to-face at a hotel for 3 or 4 days and taking a course to get a certificate, we're now saying that's off limits unless you've got the lead institution's permission?
No.
I'm thinking, yes, sir.
No, I'm saying if it's less than 20%, then
No, the whole course, you're face-to-face with I'm not picking on UF, but a UF instructor is sitting in the Marriott Waterside Hotel and you're face-to-face for the entire course. Does it or does it not apply?
I think if you turn back over to page 16 of the strategic planning and look at the language of the regulation, when they start talking about substantial physical presence, it really is talking about maintaining continuously beyond the length of a single course for any purpose related to offering a degree or certificate program, a physical location in the proposed region to include classrooms, teaching laboratories, administrative services, or student services. That kind of precludes the rental of a hotel room. The convening of students for orientation, testing, practica, and group seminars does not constitute a physical presence if no more than 20% of the course in which they're enrolled is delivered face-to-face at that location. That captures your online courses where you do have to bring people together for orientation. It exempts them from this particular regulation as long as 80% of the course is through some form of interactive technology or technology. And this aligns with the definition that was adopted by the Florida legislature as well for distance learning. The other thing that it does is it doesn't inhibit the offering of clinicals for nursing, for your pharmacy students who are out doing the practicums and internships in general. That we wanted to provide a lot of flexibility there. But what we have seen happen in a lot of cases, and in fact, this is one reason that the federal government established its new regulation on concerning distance learning, is that it can use any type of medium, and in some cases, some institutions may elect to actually establish a permanent site and have courses that are offered with students coming into a particular location and using either telepresence or interactive conferencing with a professor who's actually sitting back at the home campus. And in these cases, you might find that the university has a permanent presence in that particular area. They're actually recruiting students from that area. And, it becomes, even though it's might be considered distance learning because the student and the instructor are remote from each other, if it's synchronous activity in such a way that it'd be the same as you sitting in the classroom, then you actually have established a physical presence, and in those cases, I think this would kick in and capture those.
And then, I'm sorry, one more question, because unfortunately I think that added more questions than answers. But with the the areas where we have more than one lead institution, walk me through exactly how that's, yeah, I mean, are they negotiating everything they ever want to do? Or how do we see that happening?
Well, if you have a university that wants to go into somebody else's region, when I say somebody else's, I'm talking about the regions that are outlined in the document. What it requires, if they're going to be offering something that is already being offered in that region, is first and foremost a conversation. Now, we've been here before where people would say, well, we talk all the time. Well, we went through 3 grueling examples some months ago of exactly the contrary. People aren't talking all the time. And in order to operate a coordinated system, at the very least, if you're going to offer a program in another area in proximity to another publicly funded state university, there needs to take place a dialogue to make certain that at least we're talking about the offering and whether it represents an unnecessary or unwarranted duplication of effort. Remember, we're talking about taxpayer-funded programs, student tuition-driven programs. If the organizations within that region are fine with what is being proposed, then it can be offered. And we've seen that on regular occasion too. And Governor Beard, I'm not taking exception to what you said, but a tweet. Facilities are a good example. University of Florida is now located in Lake Nona. But I was tweaking what I think you meant to say. It's not traditional classroom programming. It's research. And there will always be opportunities, and should be, for significant movement around the state by multiple universities when it comes to that. And I only tweaked that because I know that's what you meant.
Yeah, well, we don't want to create impediments to any research or
Correct.
or private sector efforts.
But in those cases where you're talking about basic baccalaureate programming, for example, at the very least there ought to be a dialogue among institutions to see if in fact that represents a problem for people. And if it does, then there needs to be a resolution to it. Good, bad, or indifferent, depending on where you sit, I guess, but there ought to be a resolution to it.
But it says here degree program or certificate program, which, so I guess that's part of where I'm having my ambiguity, because that's not a taxpayer-funded, typically, type of thing. I mean, so to me, that's very confusing if we're talking both.
Richard?
Will you have permission?
Yes, I'm sorry, Richard.
Actually, it varies from university to university whether or not a certificate program is offered off the regular FTE funding stream. And, you know, a lot of them are offered as continuing education on a cost recovery basis. There are universities that offer postgraduate certificates that where they do count the FTE into it. Sometimes it depends on where they offer it and how the university chooses to organize themselves. And going back just a little bit to Chair Parker's comment about the universities negotiating with each other within their districts. I mean, a good example, and this was raised when we first started talking about this, is you look at the Northwest region with 3 universities that are positioned within that region. And the question was whether or not they needed to actually discuss things with each other when they're talking about doing academic programs. Well, I think we've had a very recent example of why that's an important activity for them to take place. And then with regard to Florida State University and FAMU sitting basically a couple of hills apart, I think it's very important for them also to begin to look at what they're talking about with regard to academic programming going forward. And that was going in part back to the first portion of that particular regulation where there's needs to be some coordination.
I'm sorry, just one more.
Go ahead.
So is this if we're proposing something that's not already being offered, or is it just we're proposing something, period? I mean, I'm trying to reconcile where these regulations are going to fit into our planning process, and, you know, is it, can you take a
I walked into, Madam Chair, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. It's fine.
I walked into a good example of an offering. I was at the Higher Ed Coordinating Council meeting at St. Pete College the other day. and there was a presentation there by the University of Florida representative who represents their pharmacy program, which is actually offered on the campus of St. Pete College. Now, obviously, they started that program well before the University of South Florida was approved for beginning a pharmacy program. It wasn't offered in that part of the state. And so the University of Florida stepped in and said, we'll do it because we have a pharmacy program. So they were able to provide an offering in a part of the state where it didn't exist at that point. My conversation, though, with the representative was, are there conversations taking place currently as to what's going to happen when the University of South Florida's program grows and matures, and how we're going to deal with this? Are we going to end up with two pharmacy programs in the same place? And is that good business? I don't have an answer for that. But my point was, you need to begin those conversations now, because I would hate to see somebody come along and take the program that was there, that was offered, that was good, that was grounded and matured there, and suddenly say, you got to go because we're moving in. But right now, there's really no contingency for how you're going to deal with that if and when that arises, other than you hope the two universities talk and work it out.
Dr. Max?
We'll be happy to consider whether to let South Florida have their program there.
Oh, my God.
If they file a petition and properly meet with us.
I guess the one question
Hold your
that I
breath.
have is
That's magnanimous.
is there and I understand, Governor Edwards, you have a comment. A question that I have is, to me, even when things operate quickly, they don't happen overnight. I mean, it takes a while for our universities to get to a point where they actually are moving forward with the program. And in my experience, it's almost a 1 or 2 year process usually. There's been some conversation going on for some period of time. And my question is there some concern about if I talk about it, then it's going to be seen as someone's going to take my good idea? And so I don't want to have that conversation because this was my good idea, and if I start talking about it too early, my idea is going to be stolen. I mean, and is that part of the issue? And I don't know that. That's why I'm asking the question, and I'm throwing it out there.
Can I take a stab at that? Some of that's probably true. I mean, there are only several reasons why you don't talk to your colleagues. One is you're afraid to do it because the answer might be, I got a problem with it, or it's just easier to ask for forgiveness than it is for permission. And sometimes you just don't feel like it's necessary because you don't think you're doing something that impinges upon what your colleague may be doing. The motivation behind it isn't a question here. The fact that we should be dialoguing as a system on these things before these issues reach critical mass, and once they do become so big with so many players and so many commitments made, you're now stuck virtually with what's been presented. This does engage conversation earlier. Now, like many around this table, I've been involved in economic deals for a long time. One of the hallmarks of big economic deals is confidentiality. The fact that you don't want word getting out too soon because of a variety of reasons, and it makes good sense. But as part of a system, at some point, sooner than later, those conversations need to be expanded to include the system. Otherwise, you literally are just reading these things in the newspaper. And I got to tell you, that's not unusual. To read something in the newspaper that a university is not only proposing, but has just been approved by their board of trustees. Love local control, love devolution of authority, but at some point, you can't organize a system based on newspaper clippings. You've got to, as a system, engage in those conversations long before final decisions are made. Finding the balance with this thing is important because you also don't want to stifle economic development opportunity. You want to create it. You don't want to stop good ideas. You want to foster them. But without some kind of an organized approach to it, you're simply, at some point, the victim of what may seem to be a really great idea, but may totally fly in the face of where the system is trying to go and what the system is trying to do. It's a delicate balance.
Governor Edwards?
When I first read these regulations, I couldn't help but get the feeling that we set out to burn a trash pile and burn the whole forest. I understand the intent, and certainly I agree with the intent. My original concern as to the merit also involved Florida A&M, Florida, and Florida State, which had kind of historically had regions that were statewide jurisdiction. I still support the concept, most definitely. My concern again is that we started out to build a wing and wound up with an airplane. I mean, it's just it's complicated. Maybe we need to be that way. I have expressed my concern to staff. They agreed with some of my issues. They did not agree with others. I would hope, and I think there will be a good effort on part of staff to take everybody's concerns here, rewrite some of this, and hopefully we'll wind up with a good regulation.
And we're working to do just that.
Dr. Matson, you have any comments? Me? Only Dr. Matson in the room.
Well, first of all, like Governor Edwards, there should be no problem with anyone in the room endorsing the goals of what we say we're trying to do, especially when we define them more objectively the way Governor Beer did. I don't have any problem with that, and I think the system's role is to do that, without question. And in fact, some of the rhetoric that I've had with individual governors in the last 24 hours has been very encouraging and very supportive of the goals, and I'm all in for that. The problem is the language in the regs don't match the rhetoric. We are a long way from having a set of regulations that I can feel comfortable with in the sense that they will move us towards the goals without severely impacting the University of Florida and probably some others. Just the questions that have come up this morning in the last 30 minutes ought to suggest to you that we got a lot of issues to sort out here. Now, I think the problem we've got is the way the process has unfolded. This should be handled in more of a charrette than a mail in your comments and wait for changes approach. Now, I think that it's important, if the board believes it's that important, and I wouldn't question that decision at all, you need to get the representatives in a room and talk about this. That has not happened. The process that unfolded was mail-in comments, no feedback, new version. And we have not had a chance in these very complicated areas to have a real dialogue. And for that reason, I question whether I understand the timeline issue, and I still think the board could say that you want a timeline that brings it to some conclusion whenever. But to notice these sets it up for moving down the track. And I believe it's true that if you decide to significantly modify a noticed regulation, you got to renotice it. So the question the board needs to decide today is, are we ready to notice these regulations? Or do we want to think about some other kind of process to try to get at the goals that have been espoused?